Well, it's a very fine thing to have as a guest on this little broadcast, or narrowcast, if you prefer to call it that, the former leader of the opposition, the former head of the Reform Party, which brought some considerable changes to the entire federal scene, known in many other capacities as well. This is Preston Manning. Mr. Manning, it's good to see you again, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Rex. Good to see you.
No one ever says that means it. Let me start by just going into the business of the present moment. As I'm doing this interview, it's a few days, a couple of, maybe a week or so before the next federal budget, which is something of a milestone because we haven't had one now for quite a long time. There's also not endless, but enough talk about the budget precedes the election. How are you reading just the state of play in the political arena only at the present minute?
Well, I think it's very chaotic, and I think the current government's got a lot to answer for. Even this fact that the budget is there's not really been a budget for 2 years. There are no answers to these questions as to what's the economic impact of some of the measures that they've adopted. What was the economic consequences of signing the Paris Accord? What were the economic consequences of adopting the carbon pricing regime? What are the economic consequences of shutting down the economy and these health protection measures? I think these are a lot of unanswered questions. And of course, with the Parliament not sitting or having only these abbreviated sessions, it's extremely difficult to hold the government accountable as they ought to be held accountable in a democracy.
Well, when you came into politics in a large way on the federal scene, you introduced an idea that actually caught on with the other party as well. Up to that point, it had been not dismissed, but certainly passed by. And that was, excuse me, and that was that the financial expenditures of a government, if they get it too extended, will have a great cost. And you were one of the first ones to warn that we must put some sanity into the outflow of funds. Now, that was then in the 90s. There has not been, and you know this better than I, there has not been expenditure on this scale and in this speed. It's almost a year and a bit since the Confederation was formed. Is there any way of assessing, even at this stage, when I gather no one is really keeping inventory, of what an expenditure of close to $400 billion in deficit and over $1 trillion in debt, what does that harbor for the future?
Well, I think, as you well know, this constant running up of deficits and debts means that eventually the next generation has to pay for that, and will pay for it in increased taxes and a slowdown in economic activity because the country can't carry that burden. Well, one of the differences, Rex, and you've probably noticed this, between the deficit and debt concern of, say, the 1990s and today, when Reform raised that, and other people raised it, the Taxpayers Federation, the think tanks, and everybody else, in the 1990s, the Liberals didn't say it wasn't a problem. That they acknowledge, yeah, you got to do something about it, but you guys are going too fast, or what you're proposing is the wrong way, but we're going to address it. The difference today is that there's absolutely no acknowledgement from the federal Liberal government, or even the finance minister, that this is a problem. They bought this idea that you can spend money, borrow money, and print money ad infinitum as long as it doesn't appear to be creating inflation immediately. And that's a huge difference between fighting the deficit and the debt in our day and trying to fight it today.
Is it also a huge difference? I mean, it was a serious problem, as you just indicated, to the point that the other parties agreed to it, and at least they knew it was a problem. But is the scale this time, and I emphasize this, over so short a period, we were promised a balanced budget in 2019, and by the end of 2020, we were 400 billion plus in debt. Now, that's a rocket going through the economy. And again, I ask, what are the likely consequences, apart from just simply saying the next generation? What's it doing to the whole fabric of the country?
Well, I think it destroys investor confidence in the country as a whole. Investors look at this. I think one of the reasons the federal Liberals are under such pressure to call an election, that even their own people have told them, you better do it before the economic and fiscal shoe drops on this. because eventually the public is going to see what the consequences of this are, and the consequences will not be pretty, and you'll pay a political price. One of the other differences, like I think the last time the country got into something like this was actually in the unlimited spending to deal with the Second World War. And it's interesting, my father was Premier of Alberta at that time and dealt with the Mackenzie King's war cabinet. His finance minister was a guy by the name of Ilsley. Father said he was well named because he was almost ill over what was happening with the federal financing. And he said, like, my father went to these federal provincial conferences during the war, and Ilsley was the finance minister. And the guy was just literally frustrated, worried. He would actually take out a bottle of pills and take them during the meeting because we were spending money. There was nothing you could do about it. They were borrowing money, and he had no idea what they were the consequences would be. Yeah. And contrast that with today, where the finance minister just, don't worry, no problem, be happy. It's just, it's the height of irresponsibility.
Allied to that, here's something else. I know they have their daily announcement from what I've been calling the Tent of Commons, dispersing 10 billion here and 1 billion for we and this and that and the other thing. But on the other side of the ledger, this pandemic, as it is termed, over the last year, and the measures brought in every province and territory to deal with it, has been an explosive attack on every medium-sized and small-sized business, that, with very few exceptions. Is anyone doing an inventory of how much damage is already been done to the economic fabric of, as I've said, the medium and the small business, or the private business, the person, the man and the wife in the small shop?
Well,
we know how hard it is.
Well, I think this is a great weakness in the reporting of the consequences of this COVID-19 and the health protection measures that have been adopted. As you say, these daily reports focus mainly on reporting the number of cases. There's no reporting by the Prime Minister or the premiers or their health officers on the consequences of the health protection measures. How many businesses have gone down? How many charities have gone down? What's the increase in alcoholism? What's been the increase in suicides? What's been the increase in all these negative impacts? And there's very little reporting of that. So that if that was reported, the public and governments could strike some kind of balance between, look, here's the health consequences of this COVID-19, but here's the other consequences. And I think one of the challenges of government is strike a balance between them, not to be all on one end and completely ignore the other.
Well, I think that's a very serious thing. Everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people can report on an anecdotal level in every province and territory that they're aware of either an acquaintance or a place that they used to frequent, either for business or socializing, which involves some business. You also have in almost all the provinces. I mean, my own in Newfoundland, outside of the oil industry, tourism in the last number of years has been a big deal. That's true in every province. British Columbia with its cruise ships. There are so many absolutely huge secondary consequences in all sectors of the economy, and I don't see any tabulation.
Well, I think one of the lessons out of this, and it's easy to look back and draw lessons, but I think one of the big lessons, Rex, with respect to how to handle a public emergency of this type, and it's much more than a health emergency. It started out as a health emergency, but it became a public emergency with all sorts of dimensions. The two lessons I take: there are no circumstances under which you should shut down your democratic institutions. And there are no circumstances under which you can entirely lock down your economy. Adopt drastic health protection measures, including applying them to the parliament and to the economy, but you don't shut them down. And the fact that we have shut them down, we're paying a price for that.
Well, I think, outside of the medical challenge itself, and maybe equal to it, when I'd say it, is that the institutions, the democratic institutions on a provincial level, you've seen authority slide between legislatures or premiers and health authorities, and there's a varying balance across the country. At the federal level, we've seen an abstention, I call it an evacuation or an evisceration, of the functioning of the federal parliament,
Yeah.
of its various committees, of debate, the absence of a budget in 2 years. Has there ever been a time in this country when the majority of democratic institutions on a national and provincial level have been so impaired and for so long?
Well, I don't think so. And like, take the federal parliament. I was in the federal parliament. It's on average for 100, 120 days a year. Last year it sat for 84, and half of those sitting days were virtually meaningless. So you had a 30% reduction in the functioning of the parliament at a time when you would think the necessity of even getting the members together and letting each of them give a 3-minute report on what the COVID situation was in their riding, or what the economic consequences or the financial consequences would have been helpful, but none of that was done. And the other thing, and I mentioned this to you when we were talking before, I keep in touch with some of the pollsters, and I kept asking them over this last year, is there been a flicker of public concern about the fact that their legislature has been virtually shut down, or that the House of Commons has been shut down? And the worrisome thing, Rex, is my pollster friend said there's not been a flicker of public concern that we can measure. And one fellow said to me, I think they could shut the parliament down for 2 or 3 years and the public wouldn't even notice it, or they wouldn't care if they did. And that's a symptom of some problem with our commitment to democracy that is even deeper than the COVID crisis itself.
Well, again, call it the ease with which, or the lack of storm over the injuries being done to democratic process. You have flares when, for example, just take as an example only, there are other ones and there are larger ones, when the business of $1 billion was being passed over to the wee bunch to administer a public program. The attempts to get any kind of satisfactory accounting for how that came to pass, what the intermixture between political authorities and the so-called charity authorities, you get a couple of days, a flare of public debate or interest, but then it simply dissipates and vanishes into the air. This is another thing that COVID has done. COVID has smothered many of the persistent and present major issues in this country because it has, again, such an anxiety factor.
Well, one of the other related dimensions of that, Rex, is that these health protection measures, and I'm not minimizing the need for health protection measures, particularly as applied to the most vulnerable. But one of the other consequences has been the violation of every single right and freedom supposedly guaranteed by the Charter. Every one of them, from freedom of speech to freedom of assembly to equality rights, every single one of those rights has been violated. And if you go by the rule of law, by the Constitution, the first clause in the Charter says you can do that. You can limit the exercise of these rights, provided you demonstrate the reasonableness and the justification for them. And where has that demonstration been? Certainly, it's not been presented to the public. It's not been presented to the Parliament. I think, again, the fact that Canadians seem to accept this massive limitation of their rights and freedoms in the name of health protection, again, is a worrisome thing from a democratic standpoint.
Well, it's also, I'll underline that I totally agree with what you said, and would say it even louder, but we're also seeing, especially as a year has passed, that the operations of some of our police forces, and probably most likely under either tacit or explicit instruction from their political masters, that if there's any violation of what we call the COVID regime, and that's a good word in this context, the police act with some considerable exuberance that may not be present in other things. I see that there's a church out in your province that, inspires a massive police presence, whereas in downtown Toronto last summer, we could have large scale demonstrations. And that seemed to be okay. Even the Prime Minister could come to that, and as he did, take a knee. Are we getting a sample here that once you start to lower the boundaries of what can and cannot be done, and then you start to circumscribe liberties under this particular regime, you can quickly drift to a place where you don't want to be.
Well, yeah, yes, and again, the worry is that if the public starts to just accept that you can, every time there's a big public emergency, you can limit all the constitutional rights. It makes the charter a pretty meaningless development. I think the other thing, Rex, that I try to get people onto. I mean, we could go through the list of problems and negatives that this current situation has brought out. I try, in fact, I wrote a book a while back on do something.
Mm-hmm.
I worry, particularly about the younger generation with this social media where you can talk about something, you can converse about it, you can blog about it, you can tweet about it. And in the end of the day, many people seem to think discussing it is an end in itself. And I say discussion's fine, but at the end of the day, what are we going to do about it? And I think that becomes the more relevant question right now. What are we going to do about this weakening of democracy? What are we going to do about this inattention to the deficit and the debt? What's the doing part?
Well, no, that's very true. I think you could even expand it. I noticed that in American politics, say over the last 20, 25 years, and one in particular, you have all the blogs and the think tanks and the opinion pages and the wise books and the touring author and all this, doing the diagnosis and having these splendid panel discussions at numerous conferences. Yeah. And it takes you a while to absorb a simple fact that even though some of these essays are brilliant and some of the panel discussions are quite wonderful, they're all plowing the same dough. It's the same thing over and over and over. And it is just talk, even though the talk may have some wisdom, but the politics declines even more and more. And here in Canada, I don't know either. What's the lack of inspiration here? Analyze for me, you were a leader of the opposition. Surely in this period, we can hit the government, and I will, every single day. But isn't there some functional responsibility to a real opposition? Where's the NDP? In fact, where are the Conservatives in giving a vigorous enough voice to all the things that you're talking about?
Well, and I think, right, one of the reasons I was, at least I felt I never was that effective an opposition leader was because I don't like just opposing things. What I wanted to do was propose alternatives.
That, I remember some of your speeches.
And I think that's a factor that if the opposition is just seen as being against everything the government's doing just by definition, I think that contributes to this public. But
I think, with all respect, in this particular case, at least a portion of the opposition, certainly the NDP, and to a less visible degree, even the Bloc, which is against us. Yeah. And I'll say it. I want to have you say it. The current leader himself, he's not so much against everything as that he should be the shield and the banner about all the circumscription of our rights, and we're not getting it to the volume that we need.
Yes, no, I think that's true. And that's, again, an indication of a weakness on the democratic front. One of the opportunities that this crisis creates democratically, and I don't know if the parties will take advantage of it, during the Second World War, I keep mentioning my father's experience, but he dealt with 4 federal administrations: Mackenzie King's, Louis Saint Laurent's, John Diefenbaker's, and Lester Pearson. And he said the strongest cabinet he dealt with, even though he didn't agree with him on everything, was Mackenzie King's war cabinet. Because the country got into such a big problem, the king could go out and put his finger on people who normally wouldn't have touched the federal parliament or politics with a 10-foot pole. Saint Laurent was not really even a politician. He was a brilliant constitutional lawyer from Quebec with no idea of a political career. But King could go and say, look, your country is in great trouble. You better come. And C.D. Howe, who was the minister that organized basically all the wartime production thing, he went out and got a couple of dozen people from the private sector, people that were making piles of money and perfectly content doing business and no intention to, and Howe said, you got to come and help organize wartime production. And when they asked him, what do you pay me? He said, I'll pay you $1 a year and you still come. I don't know whether this crisis has reached that point now, but it seems to me, and particularly with the parties approaching an election and some candidate recruitment being done, that this country's in enough trouble that maybe you could go to some people that normally wouldn't touch it, but have some real expertise to add to this situation. And that would do something to restore some public confidence in the parliament and whoever forms the next government.
It's also come back to the civil liberties and also the circumscription of parliamentary function. I think everybody seems to forget that this is not some vast majority government. I mean, if you had 300 seats, one party had 300 seats in the House of Commons, they couldn't have more liberty with the extension of authority, the expenditure of money, and the disappearance of accountability than this minority regime.
I wish Rex, I wish the backbenchers would show more gumption, even on the government side. I used to have a speech when I was in the parliament directed mainly at the liberal backbenchers, and the subject of it was, can you count? Can you count that? Do you notice that in this chamber, there are actually more of you than there are guys sitting on those front benches? And if you ever exercised the power of numbers, which is what a chamber has, you could give more direction than what has been received now, and direction that's coming from rank and file people, not from the top.
Just a couple of particular questions. Not fascinated on the wee thing, but going back to it, we have this very strange interlude with, as I said, the massive expenditure. We had the resignation of a finance minister, and I don't think it made a bigger ripple in the pond than if you dropped a grain of sand in. Things that were extraordinary in terms of political impact in previous days, in this new, I don't know, loosely liberated political atmosphere, really big things happen, and 24 hours or less, they're not there anymore. We have a new finance minister, we have no budget, we have 2 years off, we have a parliament that's half closed. Oh, that's okay.
Well, I think part of this, Rex, is that so much of politics and the public's view of government is occurring in a virtual world as distinct from the real world. I've argued, I don't think the country has a prime minister. What we have is an amateur actor playing the role of prime minister. I don't think we have a finance minister. We have maybe a well-meaning journalist, but she's playing the role of finance minister. There's nothing in her background, economically, fiscally, or anything else that would qualify her to be finance minister. And we're getting that politics and government is a role played mainly in front of the media and increasingly in the social media, and the actual realities are something else. And sooner or later, we got to get back to reality. I've used the analogy, like there's all these medical shows on television, some very good. I watched that New Amsterdam, I think. And those actors, now if you watch those actors operating on somebody, you'd say, by golly, that person really seems to know what they're doing. But if you were sick, really sick, and had to have an operation, who would you want to do the operation? One of those actors who can play the role of a doctor, maybe more charismatically and attractively than the real thing, or would you like to have a real doctor, even if the guy's got a wart on his nose and is bald and doesn't look very attractive?
I got a couple of particulars. The very first action, and this is really surprising. It's a very big world. It has massive controversies and issues and superpowers and all sorts of threat and anxiety. And probably the signature announcement on his first day as president was Mr. Biden going after the pipeline, and so little response from the federal authorities. What was the consequence of that decision in Alberta, and why was it made so quickly and such a priority for Mr. Biden?
Well, I think this gets into this lack of balance between energy development, including hydrocarbon energy, and environmental protection, and this polarization of everything in the political arena. Particularly in the US, you've got the government, including the Democrats, away on one side, emphasizing environmental protection, regardless of what the impacts are on anything else, and nowhere near the priority that should be given to energy development, continental energy development. The reason the oil sands were originally developed by J. Howard Pugh, his Sun Oil. I went to a meeting with him in the, when would this have been? This had been 1960s. It was the first time I ever heard the phrase continental energy security. The Sun Oil Company and the Sun Shipbuilding Company built a lot of the tankers in the Second World War that carried oil to Europe. A lot of them sunk in the North Atlantic by submarines. And Pew was almost fanatical on the fact that North America was not secure from an oil standpoint, and he was going to go out and find all the unconventional oil sources and bring them into development in order to have continental energy security. That's what got him up to Fort McMurray. And that whole aspect of the need to balance environmental protection with your commitment to energy security and energy development is just missing in the United States completely, and is missing here, frankly, with the federal government, the federal Liberal Party.
And the federal Liberal Party is infatuated with its own delusionary idea that it's a leader in the fight against climate change. Canada cannot be a leader in the reduction of the global atmosphere. It just
no, and the best thing, if Canada wants to make a contribution, shipping LNG gas to China, that would do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than anything that can be done here domestically. Unfortunately, under that Paris Accord, you don't get credit for reducing someone else's greenhouse gas emissions, even if the reduction is 10 times greater than what you can do domestically. So I just think this polarization on this issue, one of the roles that the Conservative Party of Canada should play is where's the balance? Where's the balance? Let's do environmental impact assessments on economic development. I'm in favor of that. But let's do economic impact assessments on environmental protection measures. Exactly. So the government can stand there and say, here's this impact, here's this impact, here's the balance between them.
It also ties in very, very largely with something else. You've already exposed or explicated the likelihood that in the next year, 2, 3 years, whenever this debt comes due, and it always will, that we're going to need to be at our economically most capable. And at the same time as we're building up huge debt and deficit, there's a full organized campaign underwritten to some degree by the federal government itself to hobble one of the chief industries of the entire country and alienate an entire province. This makes no sense.
Oh, and ignoring the realities, I mean, the demand for oil globally is still increasing, 100 billion barrels a day. And are you going to have that demand met from production from countries that don't have the same environmental standards as ours, or the same ethical standards, or the same conditions as ours, or is that demand going to be met by some of the most responsible petroleum development in the world? And Canada could take advantage of an opportunity there, but our government's on the wrong side.
Again, I said earlier on that COVID acts as a blanket or a screen for other issues that have been there and are there and will continue to be there. One of them being that before the medical crisis, the agitation and anxieties felt out west over economics and over the attack on the oil industry, the depression of oil prices, the flight of headquarter companies, the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. Alberta was at a broil. COVID has slightly taken that off the page, but I would wonder with Biden's announcement and with the possibility of the cancellation of Line 5 from Michigan, what's the sentiment in Alberta now on the question of, are they getting a reasonable arrangement in this confederation?
One of the big worries, I'm glad you bring that up, Rex, because I don't think Central Canada appreciates this. The growth in Western alienation and the number of people that are actually seriously considering the secession option is growing, and it is deep and it is serious. And I think one of the challenges to the federal political parties in the next election, the question that they are going to be asked here, and they should be asked from the standpoint of the country as a whole, is what do you have to propose to deal with this Western alienation and growth in separatist sentiments? Are you or are you not going to offer a domestic free trade agreement? Because of these barriers to interprovincial trade is part of the problem. Are you or are you not going to provide unobstructed transportation corridors to the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic so interior provinces can get their stuff to seaboard? Are you going to reform federal provincial transfers? Here you've got a province that's kicked in $600 billion over the last 30, 40 years to the treasuries of the federal government and other provinces, and it gets into trouble and nothing comes back. What do you think the reaction is going to be? Are you going to balance this environment and energy development? Are you going to, I've never been a big fan of constitutional amendments because they're so difficult to get, but if I could get one, and almost every province would go along with this, there should be a constitutional amendment prohibiting federal spending, taxing, legislating, and treaty making in areas of provincial jurisdiction, such as natural resources, and joint jurisdiction, such as health and the environment, unless the federal government gets the consent of the affected province. I think 50% or more of the national unity problems in this country have been created by federal intervention into areas of provincial or joint jurisdiction. That restricting that one factor could do an awful lot to hold the country together. And most provinces would go along with that amendment. What you need is an ally in that federal parliament, some government that's committed to it from the federal level. And if I was asking questions at a election meeting for the next federal election, the question I would ask of each candidate, is your party committed to providing that kind of protection or not?
Well, it's a kind of a curious thing. I agree with you. I think, again, the alienation is deep. I have some fair traffic in and out of the Western provinces myself on a personal level only. I think it is smothered and ignored, and I believe it is swelling as well. But I do not see that there will be any champion of it. I didn't even see it to go back when Mr. Biden made his announcement. I saw no explosion, even from all the Western MPs, which basically are all Western Tory opposition MPs. One would have thought something much more vigorous, but we're being careless. And at the same time, COVID has given the federal government in particular, we've noted it already, the absence of the parliament, the accounting and the spending, they're untethered. They don't have to feel the results of some regional discontent because there's no opposition there. Fine, I'll put it to you this way. You came into federal politics more or less under the mantra that the West wants in. And for a while, you made it to opposition leader. I was around during the follow-up to that election. It seemed like for a while, at least, this problem was being solved. Now it's back sharper than ever, I think.
Oh, it is, and again, the federal parties have to address it, and I don't know if they are. One of the analogies that we used to use, and it's still applicable today, in the oil patch, there's such a thing as a wildcat well that's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down there. And then there's such a thing as a rogue well that hits a pocket of oil and gas under such pressure, it blows the drilling platform off the wellhead. It can catch fire. It can be extremely dangerous. And yet there's a lot of energy down there if you could ever harness it. And one way of dealing with that is to drill in a relief well from the side. And the angle has to be right. If it's too shallow, it won't take off enough pressure. If it's too deep, it can turn into a rogue well. But if it's just right, it can use that pressure that's coming out of that rogue well and harness it. And then you've got a very useful major source of energy. And in a way, back in our day, there was a lot of secession sentiment in the 1980s and early 90s. And there was a secession party, a secessionist member got elected to the Alberta legislature. And what Reform did was drill that relief well in from the side. But you have to connect with it. You have to connect with what's causing the unrest. I don't see any federal party yet conscious of the need for that relief well to deal with Western alienation and Western secession. And if it's not there, that sentiment can turn into a rogue well that'll cause a lot of problems for whoever forms the federal government.
Mr. Manning, it's a nice thing to reconnect with you. And I'd like to say thank you very much for having a chat.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, Rex.
Next time I'll have a haircut.
Okay.
Take care of yourself.
Okay, bye-bye.